All right, hello and welcome back to part 2 of episode, I believe now 4. And so I'm here with Pastor Steve Burrell from Faith Baptist Church. And if you haven't seen the new episode yet, the first one, he talks about his call into ministry and how he was saved, and a little bit of how he came here to Faith Baptist Church. We talked a little bit about his ministry experience right after college and the importance of education when going into ministry. And so if you haven't watched that, please go back and watch it. It will be a good benefit and kind of a good background to what we're going to be talking about now. And Pastor, I want to get into you coming to Faith Baptist Church. And, you know, I interned here last summer with you, so you kind of gave me a brief explanation of how you came to the church, but I'd love for them to hear it from your perspective, because you find out that this church, the pastor has just passed away, and spiritually, not in the highest of highs, to say the least. But I want you to give them, you know, what it was like. Now resume where we left off in terms of the call, and then express how old you were when this happened as well, because I think that's very important.
Yeah, so I was 26 when I came to be the pastor here at our church. My wife and I had a 2-year-old daughter, and she was pregnant with our son Titus at the time. And so that's my age. Now, I'm not sure I recommend a 26-year-old going into the pastorate like that. You know, for some guys that works out well, but even for myself, I'm not sure that I was quite ready, but in God's providence and in God's timing, I know that that was His will.
Of course. And so, do you remember that first Sunday when you came here? What was it like?
Sure. So the first Sunday I ever preached here, I was just candidating, you know, and so I think probably that Sunday was a Sunday that was filled with there was a lot of skepticism. You know, I even overheard a few people saying, you know, he's so young, and so forth. So there was a little bit of skepticism there. But honestly, and again, every church's process in calling a pastor is different. But I preached that Sunday morning and Sunday night, did a question and answer session the preceding Saturday evening with the congregation. There was about 30 voting members in the church at that time. I think there was 27 voting members that cast a vote on the night I was called to be the pastor. But about 30 voting members in the church, and then they voted on me the first Sunday I preached here, and I got the vote. So, and I got 100%, which sounds impressive, but when you realize only 27 votes were cast, that's not so impressive. The spirit of the room was a mix of skepticism but also optimism, because I knew there was a palpable sense of faith that God could do great things in the future, and that there was hope. And I remember that very, very specifically.
Now, you had about 30 people is
Right.
what you had. No children besides your own.
Right.
To now, and again, we credit you as being the pastor that's here.
Sure.
But obviously with the Lord's help, you're now running about 150, and certain Sundays it can peak higher, which is amazing, to say the least, what the Lord has done here. To go from that number to now having multiple visitors coming through the doors. But initially, you know, it wasn't like that.
Right.
You didn't wake up and you had 150 people plus coming to your church. So what did those, if we could put in quotation marks, dead days that you had to overcome, and what was the spiritual shift that happened in order for it to go from a dying church of older people to now having young families with multiple kids? Because I mean, if you were here at the church, you would see the kids are running around like crazy, which is awesome.
Yeah.
But what was it like on those dead days? What spiritually changed for, you know, the Lord in order to Him to work here and now have multiple families that have joined?
Sure. So I think first of all, one of the things that comes to mind is that in those initial days, there was a lot that was up in the air. You know, I didn't know if God was going to kind of revive and revitalize this church. I didn't know what God's plan was. I just knew He wanted me here for this season. early on I felt the impression that Jesus loved this church a lot more than I did, and that Jesus gave himself for the church. And so knowing that Jesus loves this church, knowing that Jesus gave himself for this church, I believe that ultimately what happened to this church was up to the Lord and his enablement. I will say this about the church at that time, is though we were small in number and though it was an older church, an older congregation, there was a genuine desire in the hearts of the people to grow. That desire just had to be kind of channeled, and probably a sort of an outline, a plan. I'm not crazy about the word vision, but a vision sort of had to be cast for how to do that functionally, how to get out there in the community, how to reach people, how to get guests in, ultimately how to see people saved, baptized, discipled, and then become members of the church. And so I think just creating an environment where you sort of chart a course and say, hey, with God's help, this is where we're going, and then start trying to figure out how to get there. And that's basically where I was in those days, I think.
Yeah. Was there ever a point in time in your ministry that you wanted to quit?
Oh, yeah, about every Monday. But for sure, there were a lot of times COVID was devastating for me, spiritually and emotionally, because I'd been here maybe about a year and a half, if I remember the timeline correctly, when COVID hit. We'd gone from 30 to maybe 50 or 60 in Sunday worship. And again, our sanctuary will seat about 350, so it still feels empty with 60 people in it. But that being said, we hit COVID. We closed down for several weeks. We did all the online services, the parking lot services, and so forth. We returned from COVID with about the same amount of people we started with, and so you had to start all over. And so there was a lot of ups and downs, as there can be in ministry. But I feel like for me personally, the great lesson that God was trying to teach me was that my identity can't be rooted in the size of my church or the number of people that are attending the services or listening to the messages or any of those measurable metrics. My identity has to be in Christ. And again, because Christ loves this church, because Christ called me to this church, then what happens here, as long as I'm faithful, is ultimately his responsibility. And I think having that paradigm went a long way.
Yeah. So a lot of small churches are okay with staying small. They get comfortable. So how did you shift that culture from just us 30? And I know you mentioned, the church was excited, but how are you able to, have them come back with that welcoming mindset? Because it can be discouraging when it's years of ministry that you don't see someone come through the doors. Their pastor has just passed away. They don't know. Again, there's not a lot to look forward to in that sense. But how are you able to help them understand that, hey, we can reach more people for Christ? Because, if you came to Jefferson and you saw it, it's not a big town. You have a bunch of different churches around the area. But to be able to have and point people to come here to Faith Baptist, again, with the Lord's help, but what else was there to help the congregation understand, hey, it's not just us. We want to grow more. We want more people to come through the doors. Sure.
I wish I could look back and say that, here was my clearly outlined strategy and I followed this. But I didn't have that. I'll be honest with you. I'm not a very strategic, operations, type person. If I wasn't a pastor, I certainly wouldn't be like an operations manager. That being said, someone gave me a great piece of advice, and they said, healthy things grow and healthy things multiply. And so I began to ask myself, what can I control? And you'll remember in your internship, every week there's 4 things we talked about. As a pastor, what are my responsibilities? What are my big rocks, so to speak? What do I have to do well? I preached on it this morning to some degree. There were a lot of things Joshua might have done, but there were a few things that he must do in order to please the Lord. So as a pastor, what are those things I must do? I have to know my sheep, feed my sheep, lead my sheep, and protect my sheep. So I kind of just reduced it down to making sure I did those things that God gave me to do. And then as I had opportunity, I would ask the church to give me some leeway to try some new things, to reach people. And we instituted new programs, our Faith Kids Club. And a lot of those were giant leaps of faith for us. But I think walking humbly, admitting when you try something and it doesn't work, and being willing to say, hey, that didn't pan out. I appreciate you giving me the liberty to try that. Let's try something else. But maintaining a spirit of optimism and faith. As a matter of fact, one of the first sermons I ever preached here, matter of fact, I think it was the very first sermon I ever preached here, was from 1 Samuel chapter 14, Jonathan and his armor bearer. And just two guys against this whole garrison of Philistines. And Jonathan's just full of optimism, and he says, let's go take on those Philistines. And then he said this, he says, there's no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. In other words, God didn't need a massive army and all the best equipment and all the best training to take on those Philistines. He just needed Jonathan and his armor bearer to believe that God could accomplish what they couldn't accomplish in and of themselves. And so I think when a young minister goes into a church that has been suffering from years of decline and atrophy numerically and so forth, he's got to convey constantly an attitude that says, hey, look, God can do this. And God doesn't need all the resources in the world to do it. He can take this little group and do something here that is of eternal value.
Yeah.
Wow,
that's powerful. That's powerful. So one thing about Pastor Burrell that I think is unique in terms of a lot of pastors is you love to study.
Yeah.
The one thing I picked up on our internship is you love to read, you love to study. I mean, you might not see the full picture here, but there's tons of books in here that you have, and you expressed to me, hey, one of the things you need to learn how to do is read, is study, and on average, how many hours do you spend on a sermon?
Yeah. So when people ask me how long it takes to prepare a sermon, my answer is always the same: a lifetime. Okay, because I don't think there's no formula. You put in this many hours and you get this result for a sermon. I guess I probably spend about 10 hours per sermon per week in the study. So if I'm preaching 3 sermons, I'm looking at about 30 hours in the study. Now, sometimes, a text that I'm dealing with will be a little bit less complicated, more familiar, and so forth. And so I have to kind of apportion my time accordingly. So I may spend 13 hours a week studying a complicated text that I'm preaching a sermon on, and then maybe spend 7 hours on another text and so forth. But I try to spend about 30 hours a week total in the study.
And so with putting that much time into messages, which is important, what you're called to do,
sure,
that's what you focus on, I'm sure were a lot of things around the church that still needed to get done. And when you first started, it was just you and your pregnant wife, who you probably were not going to have out there mowing the lawn or doing anything like that.
Although she did some of that, but
Which I believe it. If you miss Hannah, she's amazing. But, how were you able to trust other people in the church to say, hey, or at what point were you able to say, hey, you know what, maybe this is something I can pass on to somebody in the church?
Well, I do think you have to lead by example and make it known that you're not above doing anything. And there's nothing that goes on around here at our church that I haven't done or don't still do. I still clean toilets from time to time and set up tables and chairs and mow and do all kinds of different things. And so a pastor has to have set that example, an example of having a servant's heart, see the need, take the lead, and always being willing to do everything. And my wife's the same way. Matter of fact, I have this picture. We had a building that was under construction when we came here, and we were able to finish that within our first couple of years. But I have a picture of my wife with my son Titus, who's probably 3 or 4 months old, and Titus is strapped to her chest in one of those baby carriers, and she's painting. And she's reaching up on her tippy toes to paint a window casing, and Titus is looking up at his mom painting. And so I go back to that picture a lot, just thinking about those early days. But obviously you can't do it all yourself. So now I will say this: in those early days, I didn't spend 30 hours a week in the study. I definitely, because I was working a secular job off and on through those years as well. So I certainly couldn't. I had to rely on good curriculum and the works of others. But identifying volunteers is very important. And, what I look for basically is two things in a volunteer. Number one, I look for faithfulness over talent. A talented volunteer who isn't a faithful Christian, who doesn't faithfully participate in the ministries and life of the church, who doesn't have a devotional life, isn't head over heels in love with Jesus. They have all the talent in the world, but ultimately, I don't think they're going to be a right fit for our church. So I look for faithfulness, people who are faithfulness, and then I look for eagerness. They need to be a self-starter. And usually when someone shows eagerness to serve in a particular area and they just start to volunteer for things and assume responsibilities without being, asked or pushed into it or constrained to do it, then I will ask them to, if they'd be willing to assume more leadership roles as volunteers. And still, for a church our size, we run on a much, much smaller staff than a lot of other churches do our size, because I think we have a culture of volunteerism that has really snowballed since my earliest days here at our church. So
yeah, and I was blessed this morning when we were in service to see someone that I had met here when I was an intern, and while one of my duties here was leading music for Sunday morning, and I knew that at the time when I stepped out and the internship was done, I knew you were assuming the role of leading music for a bit, and then I come back and see one of the men in the church is now leading the music on Sunday mornings. And so that was just so encouraging to see that, hey, and I talked to him for a little bit, and I said, hey, man, it's so exciting to see you serving, up there. He's like, look, I was sitting there one time during a message, and Pastor was like, if you're supposed to serve and you're supposed to serve, then why not go out and serve? And so with encouragement like that, now you have somebody leading, music. And it was just a huge blessing to see that. And I think it's so important that, like you said, for a pastor to, assume each role that he has to, that, he's not above doing certain things. And the pastors that I've talked to, that's always a common theme, is that they were like, hey, anything around the church that you've seen that might have needed to be done, I've done it. And it's not in a prideful way, but it's in a way that's saying, hey, I'm willing to do what needs to be done. And so I think that's key and very important for a pastoral role. And
then balancing that too with Ephesians chapter 4, equipping the saints for the work of the ministry. And a pastor's primary responsibility is that of training and equipping. And so you're helping people identify, discover, develop, and then deploy their spiritual giftings. And so maintaining a healthy relationship with people so that they can approach you and feel like they're just comfortable entering into new ministry responsibilities, and also giving people an opportunity to say, hey, why don't you just try? That's one of my favorite phrases. Would you try to do this for a couple months and see if you're a good fit? And if you're not, no strings attached, you step away from it. And that gives people the liberty to try and see if they could work in a role in the church. And if it doesn't work out, they say, hey, this is not for me. No problem, no strings attached. I think that's an important tactic as well.
All right, well, that concludes this second part of this episode. And so, again, we're here with Pastor Steve Burrell here at Faith Baptist Church in Jefferson, Georgia. And so we're going to conclude this part of the episode, and we have one more that we'll be doing, and it's part of the Proven and Pursuing. We're going to talk about the proven character and pursuing for the future. Amen. And what the Lord has in store. And so, again, we're thankful that you tuned in. Again, if this was a blessing to you, please like, subscribe, pass it on to somebody that it might be of use to, and we'll see you guys in the next one.